There resides within every human soul a hidden figure, a silent companion who walks beside us from the cradle to the grave. This figure is not evil in the crude, cartoonish sense. It is not a monster with horns or fangs. It is far more intimate, far more dangerous. It is the shadow self, the repressed part of our psyche that carries our denied desires, our moral contradictions, and our concealed impulses. Most people live their lives unaware of how often the shadow makes decisions for them in secret. They wear masks of virtue, unaware that their betrayals are orchestrated not by external forces or mistakes of circumstance, but by this unseen part of themselves. Cheating, whether in relationships, in friendships, or in one's own integrity, is not born of confusion. It is born of moral compromise. It is the moment when the individual allows the shadow to take the reins of the will, and the shadow does not act randomly. It watches, it waits, it accumulates grievances, it remembers every unmet need, every slight, every disappointment that the conscious self refuses to process. When you cheat, you are not lost. You are hiding. You are stepping into the darkness willingly, not because you do not know the path, but because you refuse the discipline required to stay in the light. To cheat is to choose to bypass your inner truth. It is not a misstep. It is a surrender to the shadow's seductive whisper that says, "You deserve more, you are entitled to this, no one will know." And yet, even when no one else knows, the psyche records everything. The soul keeps a ledger that cannot be erased by excuses or rationalizations. You do not cheat and then ask for forgiveness as though you stumbled in the dark. You cheat because, at some point, you decided the light was too honest, too revealing, too demanding. What most fail to understand is that the shadow is not inherently malevolent. It is merely repressed truth. But when ignored, it distorts. When denied, it retaliates. Cheating is a manifestation of this retaliation, this psychic imbalance. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of internal rebellion, a rebellion against your own ideals, against the version of you that once vowed to honor, to protect, to remain faithful not just to another person, but to yourself. This is why moral compromise is so insidious. It doesn't announce itself with thunder. It begins in silence, in rationalizations, in justifications, in emotional avoidance. The individual who cheats has not made a mistake. They have made a pact with the shadow. They have negotiated their integrity in exchange for fleeting satisfaction, and every such exchange has a price. There is no betrayal without awareness. There is no infidelity, no deception, no violation that occurs in a state of total unconsciousness. One may claim to have been swept away by emotion, by passion, by weakness, but beneath all of these lies a fundamental truth. One must first cross a boundary to betray, and every boundary crossed begins in the mind long before it materializes in behavior. To understand cheating as a choice, one must first understand the sacred architecture of boundaries. These are not simply rules imposed by society or contracts of relationship. Boundaries are psychic structures. They mark the threshold between chaos and order, between instinct and ethics, between desire and responsibility. They are drawn not only to protect others from our impulses, but to protect us from our own fragmentation. When a person cheats, they are not confused about the boundary. They are aware of it, and they step over it deliberately, even if subtly at first. There is always a moment, quiet, internal, often unspoken, when the psyche whispers, "This is not right." And it is in that moment that a decision is made, a decision to either honor the boundary or override it. The betrayal does not begin in the bedroom. It does not begin with a text message or a secret meeting. It begins in the imagination. It begins when one entertains the possibility of betrayal and refuses to correct the thought. It begins when one chooses to indulge the fantasy instead of confronting the dissatisfaction that birthed it. Every act of cheating is an intentional act. Even if it feels spontaneous on the surface, it is preceded by a series of micro-choices, silent permissions granted by the ego to the shadow. The individual justifies these permissions by invoking loneliness, misunderstanding, emotional neglect, or even revenge, but none of these justifications erase the fact that there was a boundary and they chose to cross it. The psyche is not passive in these moments. It signals, it resists. It throws up feelings of guilt, hesitation, confusion. But when those signals are silenced, when the conscience is bypassed for the sake of desire, the soul begins to fracture. And that fracture is not temporary. It lingers, it echoes, because the person who cheats does not only betray another, they betray their own inner equilibrium. They disturb the alignment between the self they claim to be and the self they have become. We must understand that boundaries are not obstacles. They are mirrors. They reveal who we are when no one is watching. And when someone crosses those lines willingly, they reveal a disturbing truth about their relationship with integrity. They may still speak the language of commitment. They may still perform gestures of loyalty, but their actions expose an allegiance to something else, something lower, something unintegrated. Cheating, then, is not about attraction or temptation. It is about disregard for the emotional contract, for the sacredness of another's trust, and ultimately for the self. When someone crosses a line, it is because, at some level, they have convinced themselves that the line no longer matters. After the boundary has been crossed, after the moment of betrayal has taken root in the soul, the ego scrambles to protect itself from collapse. It begins to construct stories, elaborate, emotionally tinted narratives meant not to reveal the truth, but to distort it into something more tolerable. This is the illusion of justification, the psychic defense mechanism that wraps betrayal in the language of necessity. The mind becomes an architect of deception, not to deceive others, but to deceive itself. It says, "I was unloved. I was neglected. I was pushed away. I didn't mean to. I had no choice." But underneath every justification lies a fundamental avoidance, the refusal to face oneself without distortion. Justification is not a confession. It is a performance, a rationalization designed to reduce guilt without accepting responsibility. The individual seeks comfort, not healing. They are not searching for insight. They are seeking escape from the unbearable weight of accountability. And in doing so, they trade growth for illusion. The human psyche is profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of being morally wrong. It will contort itself in countless ways to maintain the myth of being a good person. It will edit memory, suppress guilt, inflate grievances, and reframe the timeline to suit a narrative in which betrayal is seen not as a decision, but as a reaction, as if the cheater was simply acted upon by life, rather than acting within it. But the unconscious mind is not fooled. The deeper layers of the soul know the difference between mistake and intention. They know when we are lying to ourselves, and the cost of these internal lies is high. They corrode self-respect. They fragment identity. They create an ever-widening gap between the mask and the true self. When one justifies cheating, they attempt to use their wounds as a license to wound others. They conflate hurt with entitlement, but pain does not authorize betrayal. Loneliness does not grant permission to deceive. If anything, such emotions are signals to confront one's truth, not flee from it. The illusion of justification is seductive because it allows the person to keep their sense of morality while doing something immoral. It is spiritual camouflage. They can still speak of love, of truth, of integrity, because they have dressed their betrayal in the garments of necessity. But what is necessary is not always what is right, and what is justified in the mind is often condemned in the heart. These justifications, if left unchallenged, become habitual. They form psychic scars. They allow the individual to repeat the same betrayal again, each time cloaked in a different story, and thus the soul becomes layered not with wisdom, but with excuses. When the human psyche is confronted with inner conflict it cannot bear to face, it often turns to one of its oldest and most cunning defenses: projection. This is the unconscious act of transferring what is unresolved within us onto another, assigning blame not where it belongs, but where it feels safer. In the context of cheating, this mechanism appears with brutal clarity. The one who betrays begins to see the cause of their betrayal not in themselves, but in the partner, in the relationship, in life itself. They externalize their discontent, crafting a version of reality where they are not the violator, but the victim. They say, "You made me do this," or "You stopped loving me," or "You didn't see me." But these statements, while emotionally compelling, are not truths. They are shields. They are the psyche's way of avoiding the mirror. For to look in the mirror would require emotional maturity. It would require an encounter with the full weight of one's own decisions, the complexity of one's desires, and the pain of one's own contradictions. Emotional immaturity recoils at such encounters. It prefers to remain in the realm of the infantile, where impulses reign and responsibility is always elsewhere. The emotionally immature self is not necessarily loud, aggressive, or wild. More often, it is subtle. It hides behind intellect, behind charm, behind eloquent language that defends dishonor with cleverness. But at its core, it is defined by a refusal to carry the burden of inner accountability. It resists discipline. It fears commitment not because commitment is oppressive, but because it reveals the limitations of the ego. It shows the child within that life is not only about what we want, it is about who we are when we don't get what we want. Projection allows the cheater to construct a self-image that is still lovable, still noble, still wounded rather than wounding. It allows them to view their betrayal as a cry for help instead of an act of harm. This delusion is comforting, but it is a dangerous comfort, for it arrests emotional development. It halts the individuation process, the deep psychological journey of integrating one's whole self, including the dark, the weak, the wounded. The emotionally immature individual cheats, not because they are inherently evil, but because they lack the courage to confront their own void. They lack the strength to hold tension, to wrestle with dissatisfaction without acting it out destructively. They seek relief, not resolution. And so, rather than facing the abyss within, they escape into the arms of another, believing that new affection will rescue them from old pain. But what they fail to understand is that no external embrace can substitute for internal integration. Emotional immaturity avoids the hard questions. Why do I feel unseen? Why do I sabotage intimacy? What unhealed grief am I carrying into this relationship? Instead, it casts these unasked questions onto the partner. The partner becomes the symbol of all that is wrong, when in truth they are merely the mirror, and like all mirrors, they do not create the image, they only reflect it. In projection, the cheater becomes both blind and deaf to the inner world. They cannot see their role in the chaos they create. They cannot hear the voice of conscience beneath the noise of blame, and so they move through relationships not as whole beings, but as fractured selves, searching for connection while running from authenticity. There is perhaps no greater power within the human experience than the capacity to choose. It is not instinct nor fate, nor even emotion that defines the moral arc of a person's life. It is will, the conscious act of saying yes or no, of stepping forward or stepping away, of aligning with truth or distorting it. And yet, in the matter of betrayal, especially in the act of cheating, people often behave as though choice is a vague, diluted force, something overpowered by mood, stress, or emotional injury. But this is a distortion of reality. To cheat is not to trip and fall, it is to walk with awareness, to observe the crossroad, and to turn in the direction that contradicts one's deeper values. It is not a moment of weakness that blinds the will. It is the will being redirected by desire. The hand that sends the message, the feet that walk into the room, the lips that form the lie, these are not the limbs of a victim. They are the instruments of agency. The betrayal does not arise from ignorance, but from preference. And preference is choice, conscious or not. The idea that betrayal just happens is an attempt to downplay the terrifying truth that at every critical moment, the individual still had access to their volition. Even when overtaken by emotion, even when submerged in disappointment, the chooser remains. This chooser, the core of the self, is always present, though often ignored. And when we suppress this inner authority, when we claim that we were swept away by circumstance, we deny the very thing that separates us from chaos, intentionality. Choice is sacred. It is the vessel through which the soul exercises its sovereignty. It is the means by which the fragmented self is either integrated or further divided. When someone chooses to betray, they are not simply harming another, they are reshaping the architecture of their own soul. They are binding themselves to a path that will inevitably demand reckoning. Because the will is not a neutral force, it carries the weight of every decision made beneath its banner. Even indecision is a form of choice. Even silence is a statement. When the person who is tempted does not remove themselves, does not speak truth, does not resist the lure, they are not passive, they are permitting. And permission, no matter how subtle, is always an act of will. This is why the language of mistake is insufficient. Mistakes are unconscious, they are accidental, they do not contain the same spiritual fingerprint that a chosen betrayal does. The person who cheats often minimizes their will in order to reduce their guilt. They say, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," or "I didn't plan it. It just happened." But the truth is that the will does not require detailed plans. It only requires allowance, a tiny permission in the mind, a small opening in the heart, and the rest follows. The will is not loud, but it is exact. It records every internal yes and every silent no. This is why true transformation cannot occur until the individual reclaims the will as sacred, until they see that every choice they make is not merely a reaction to life, but a reflection of their inner alignment. To live unconsciously is to hand over this power to the shadow, to impulse, to chaos. But to live consciously is to take responsibility not just for what happens to you, but for what you become through your choices. The cheater does not lose control, they relinquish it. They do not fall from grace, they walk away from it. They do not stumble, they pivot, and that pivot, that turning of the soul toward betrayal, is never random. It may be fast, it may be quiet, but it is always a decision that reveals far more about one's character than they are willing to admit. There is no redemption without reckoning, no true healing where denial persists. To sin is human, but to cover that sin in the gauze of excuse is to deny the very possibility of transformation. And in the case of betrayal, particularly in the intimate wound of cheating, the soul does not begin to mend through apology alone. It begins through ownership, a deep, unflinching encounter with one's own capacity for destruction. The psyche does not evolve by bypassing its darkness. It does not grow through declarations of good intent or the hope that time will dissolve the pain it has caused. It grows when it looks inward to the abyss it once unleashed upon another. When one says not, "I didn't mean to," but instead, "I chose to, and now I must understand why." Ownership is not guilt. Guilt, when unprocessed, is paralyzing. It traps the soul in shame, making it either shrink or defend. Ownership is active. It is not concerned with preserving the ego. It is concerned with aligning the fragmented self. It requires one to sit with the uncomfortable truth: I was capable of betrayal, not because I am evil, but because I am unresolved. And not because I was unloved, but because I did not know how to hold love. Not because someone failed me, but because I failed myself first. This form of ownership is not external. It does not perform repentance for approval. It is not interested in winning back trust through persuasion. It is interested only in returning the soul to wholeness, and that journey demands the dismantling of every excuse, every story the ego created to soften the blow of truth. The betrayed must be honored, yes, but the betrayer must also dare to confront the inner betrayal that made the outer one possible. Excuses are narcotics to the soul. They numb, they soothe, but they do not heal. They are sugar-coated lies we feed ourselves to avoid the bitter medicine of self-confrontation. One says it was only once, or we were falling apart anyway, or I was lonely, confused, afraid. These are not explanations, they are evasions. Healing does not come through the question of whether the pain was justified. It comes through the declaration that the pain was real, and I caused it. To own one's betrayal is to stop hiding behind the other person's flaws, to stop measuring your guilt against their imperfections. The spiritually immature mind says, "They pushed me to this." But the spiritually mature soul asks, "What inside me could not withstand the push?" Ownership is not self-blame, it is self-knowledge. And without that knowledge, there can be no integration of the shadow, no awakening of the higher self. Only the courageous accept this path, for it is not easy to see oneself not only as a victim of pain, but also as its author. But until one sees themselves fully, as both light and shadow, they will repeat their betrayals in new forms. They may change partners, change cities, change routines, but the pattern will follow them, because what has not been owned will always seek expression. And what has not been healed will always seek repetition. Ownership invites not just confession, but inquiry. It says, "What am I avoiding? What truth have I not spoken? What boundary did I erase? What hunger drives me?" These questions do not shame, they illuminate. And in the light of those answers, the soul begins to remember its wholeness. Healing, then, is not a return to innocence. It is a conscious acceptance of complexity. It is the maturity to say, "I did this. It was my hand, my will, my fracture. And now it is my responsibility to repair not just what was broken outside of me, but what was broken within." That is where true healing begins, not in pleading for forgiveness, not in crafting more elegant excuses, but in the silent, private courage to become someone worthy of trust again.